Moving around in Cinema 4D is very much a two-handed operation. Whether you use a mouse or a tablet, there are a few important shortcuts that will help you navigate with ease. Now, the most important thing I want to talk about in this movie is the use of a 3-button mouse. If you're on a PC, 3-button mouse is standard operating procedure, and you don't really need to change anything. On a Macintosh, if you're using a Mighty Mouse, then there's some important changes we need to make in the system preferences. I'm going to go to the Apple menu and go to System Preferences. And in the System Preferences window, I'm going to click on the mouse icon. Now, I have a Mighty Mouse attached to my scene, and I need to make sure that my buttons are arranged correctly. The way the Mighty Mouse works is it's got a left-hand side, a right-hand side, and then a middle scroll wheel here in the center, which is actually a ball. The primary button is set correctly. That's going to be our left mouse click. The secondary button is set correctly. That's going to be our right mouse click. The middle scroll ball, we need to make sure is set for button 3. Now, if you have it set to be anything other than button 3, go ahead and turn it to button 3 now. This is going to make the Mighty Mouse behave like a 3-button mouse on Windows or like a 3-button mouse that you would get from a third party. The buttons that are on the side of the mouse are right now set for button 4. We can leave those alone or disable them. It really doesn't matter. We won't be using them for the navigation inside Cinema 4D. So I'm going to close up the preferences and get back into Cinema 4D. Navigating in Cinema 4D is a two-handed operation. Now, this large window in the center of the interface is called the viewport, also called the editor window. And this grid area represents the perspective view. And we're looking at our world from an approximately 45-degree angle and looking down at the center of the world. That world, we're going to need to be able to move around in, and there's some important keys we're going to use to do that. First up is the number 1 key on your keyboard. If you hold that key down, that allows you to pan. Now I'm dragging in a circular motion right now, and then if I drag left and right, I can pan left and right. If I drag up and down, I can pan up and down. So you can have a lot of freedom of movement, but it's really only in 2 dimensions. Next up is the number 2 key. The number 2 key, if I hold it down and click with my left mouse button, if I drag left and right, I can dolly in or out. Now, that's very important. Do not drag up and down because that doesn't do anything. You want to drag left and right. And this is a physical dolly move. What I mean by that is that the camera is moving physically into or out of the scene. We're not changing the focal length of the lens. We're physically moving the camera closer to or further away from our subject, in this case, the center of the world. The number 3 key in the perspective view allows us to orbit around. And that orbit, by default, is around the center of the world if you don't have anything selected. Now, if I have a cube in the scene, I'm going to add a cube, and I'm going to use these handles on the cube to actually move the cube on the positive x-axis. That movement is constrained to that axis, and we'll talk more about that in a subsequent movie. But what I want to show is that Cinema 4D orbits around whatever object you have selected. I'm just going to move this cube way off in space so that it's far away from the world center. And if I have the cube selected, my camera is going to orbit around that cube. If I deselect it, it's going to orbit around the world center, and that's a really important distinction. So the camera by default orbits around what you have selected. If you don't have anything selected, it orbits around the world center. The interface that we're looking at, the viewport, by default is set for the perspective view, but there's other types of views that you have access to. And by using the middle mouse button and clicking any place in the viewport, that switches you to a 4-way split screen. That's why it's so important to have a 3-button mouse, because this navigation between screens is incredibly important. And it's the fastest way to get there is to middle mouse click in any of these windows. So whichever window I middle mouse click in, if I middle mouse click in the top, that window becomes full screen. If I middle mouse click again, it brings me back to the 4-way. So I can quickly navigate from the right view by middle mouse clicking, and I can navigate to the perspective view by middle mouse clicking, and I can get back out again. On the Mighty Mouse, it can be a little bit difficult to middle mouse click, so you may want to disable your scroll wheel in the same preferences window that we changed the button control earlier. The next thing I want to talk about is another shortcut for moving in the views, and that's using the F1 through F5 keys. Now, once again, there's a setting we need to change on the Mac, and we're going to double check it here in our system preferences. If you're on the PC, we don't need to worry about it. In the Macintosh, the F keys are not always on by default. If you've just done a clean install of your operating system, the F keys can provide a different function than what you would normally want to have in Cinema 4D. So I'm going to go to the Apple menu, System Preferences, and go to the keyboard. And I want to make sure that Use All F1 and 2 keys as standard function keys is turned on. That's very important, because we're going to be using the F1 through 5 keys for navigating through these windows as well. That's another shortcut. And if we don't have these turned on, when we hit the F1 key on a Macintosh, then we'll get some other function that is mapped to that key. So if I turn off those preferences now, and I use the F1 through 5 keys. F1 is the perspective view. Right now we're looking in the perspective view, so if I hit it, nothing will happen. F2 gives us the top view. F3 gives us the right-hand view. F4 gives us the front view. And F5 gives us the split screen. So we can go back to the perspective view by hitting F1 right here. So now Cinema 4D has two different undo buffers. It has the standard undo buffer, which includes mouse clicks and creating and deleting objects and those kinds of things. It also has an undo buffer for the viewport as well. So I'm going to talk about the standard undo buffer right now. Up here in the interface, there's two arrows, an arrow going backwards and an arrow going forward, which is grayed out right now. These are the undo and redo buttons. You can click these buttons, or you can use the keyboard shortcut. The keyboard shortcut for undo is Command or Control Z. And I'll undo that movement of the cube. Now there's 30 levels of undo inside of Cinema 4D, but we can change that at any time by modifying them in the preferences, and we'll talk about that in a later movie. The redo is a little bit different, and if you're used to using Adobe applications, then you're used to doing Shift-Command-Z for redo. Well, that doesn't work in Cinema 4D. It's Command-Y for redo. So if I hit Command or Control-Y on the keyboard, I can redo those movements. And in Cinema 4D, even mouse clicks are part of the undo. Deselect this cube. So if I hit Command or Control Z on the keyboard, then it will reselect my cube because I just deselected it, and mouse clicks are part of that undo buffer. Any navigation changes we do in the viewport can be undone or redone. So as I use the 3 key, if I hold down the 3 and orbit around my cube here, if I don't like that orbit I just did, I can hold down the Shift and Command or Control Z. So Shift plus Command on the Macintosh and Z, or Shift plus Control on the PC plus Z will give you this undo buffer. So if I do Shift Command Z right now, it will undo the viewport changes that I just did. If I do Shift Command Y, it'll redo the viewport changes that I just did. So if I middle mouse click or hit F5 on the keyboard to get to the 4-way split screen, these views here are called the orthographic views. They do not have perspective, so they're orthographic views. And so the way you navigate in those is by using just the 1 and 2 keys by themselves. The number 1 key, if I click in the top view and drag around, that allows me to pan in any of these views. If I use the number 2 key in any of the orthographic views and drag left and right, I can zoom in or out in those views. And right now I'm zooming out so I can see my cube in the scene. So that's the number 1 key to do a pan, the number 2 key dragging left or right to dolly in or out. Now that you can move around in 3D space, we're ready to explore the Cinema 4D interface.